I'm going to give you the first of probably a couple sessions on kind of the big system. If we think about kids, youth, and adults with neurodevelopmental disabilities, where and what kinds of services do they get? And we tend to know well the kinds of services that we deliver and supports that we deliver or that our family member receives or that we receive. But getting that whole picture across the life course is not often taught to everybody in every academic discipline. And families tend to get it when they are in the need for that service. So it's sort of this lived experience, not necessarily seeing what it's going to be like when my child's an adult when their child is an infant. So I'm going to spend about 45 minutes on, and I'll get as far as I can get, and then I'm going to pass it to Beth, who's going to start talking a little bit, kind of introducing the concept of policy advocacy. And throughout my slides, I've tried to illustrate how policy makes a difference and how we can tell policy makes a difference using the ADA as an illustration. So let's get started. This is kind of the main systems in which people get care and services. Some of those are very short term. Some of them are services and supports that people get across their lifespan. I think one of the most important things for you to recognize is some are entitlements, meaning if you meet the eligibility criteria, you get it. No questions asked. Some are not entitlements, and usually the more progressive long-term services and supports aren't always entitlements. So we talk about case management. It's got a lot of different names: service coordination, support coordination, those kinds of things. Children, youth, and adults who have neurodevelopmental disabilities can get case management. That point of entry is through the county. There are all kinds of residential services. 30 years ago, there was really one kind. If you were going to live outside of your family home, your options were an institution or a nursing home type facility. And now we have a broad spectrum. So I'm going to share with you what we know about where children, youth, and adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities live. You'll see that only one of those is identified as an entitlement. Again, if you meet eligibility criteria, you're entitled to it. There are a number of employment kinds of services. We need to be thinking about employment for when kids are kids in elementary school. We need to be thinking about how are we preparing them for their life out of school. And a lot of times if you work with kids, you work with kids. And you don't think about those kids when they're an adult. So in LEND, we want you to at least know what's happening with children and youth when they grow up. Education is one of the primary places that children and youth get services and supports through K-12 environments. That again is an entitlement. And a lot of policy guides that. There's an emerging post-secondary effort to get kids with neurodevelopmental disabilities transitioning from secondary school into post-secondary school. We do not have good options in the state of Minnesota. And then health care. So how many of you would consider yourself delivering the service of case management or receiving case management? Just look around so you kind of will get a sense of who your LEND colleagues are that know a lot about these systems. Okay, what about residential support? So that could be in-home family supports, out-of-home, residential school, residential living. How many of you work in this system or receive services? Long-term services and supports, okay. So a few. What about in employment? Sort of a couple of yeah, kindas. What about education? Either receive it or work in education. A lot of hands. And what about healthcare? Okay, so the trend you probably saw, a lot of hands went up for education and a lot of hands went up for healthcare, but kids get services in case management, residential, and employment areas too. And so our job in LEND is to kind of get you to be at least aware of those services and supports so that you got families and individuals that are thinking about them. Key funding, so services and supports really only happen if there's funding attached to them, unless they're natural supports that families and friends and neighbors are providing. So the overwhelming primary source of long-term services and supports in this country is funded through Medicaid. And if you are even just medium interested in policy and politics, you see and hear that Medicaid gets on the chopping block at state levels and at federal levels quite often. Well, that's because Medicaid expenditures are going up and up and up like this. And if you're trying remotely to balance a budget, it's a place where you can find revenue. So Medicaid is a primary government source of money that pays for long-term services and supports for kids. Private insurance is another very large source. Supplemental security income, which is SSI is what you hear, and that is a means-tested financial support. Many kids are eligible for SSI as a way to supplement income inside of families to support the child's needs. There's also something called RSDI, or Retirement Survivors Disability Insurance. That usually becomes available to a child once they turn 18, or if their parent dies under the age of 18. It's another financial stipend. These are like in the neighborhood of $800 a month. There's something called Section 8 housing or low-income housing, again means tested. Group residential housing allowance. So how many of you know children, youth, or adults who live in a group home? Okay, so sometimes kids who have really complex needs and the family can't meet those needs in the home, they might be placed in an out-of-home placement. If they're in a group home in Minnesota, the state supplements that provider with something called group residential housing to help cover the costs of room and board, because Medicaid home and community-based services won't cover that. So it's a unique thing to Minnesota. We have vocational rehabilitation. How many of you know clients or have people who are receiving VR services? Okay, that's usually to pay for education, training, to help a person get a job. So for example, a common thing that Voc Rehab might pay for is if you need transportation to get to a job, they might pay for the lift on your vehicle, or they might pay for you to get a certificate or a degree. So a lot of times kids who are in college or getting post-secondary education might get a supplement from Voc Rehab. Now, Voc Rehab in Minnesota and in most states does not provide a lot of service and support to people with neurodevelopmental disabilities. They're sort of notorious for, well, if you've got these diagnoses, you go to a sheltered workshop. So they'll pay for a 2-week assessment, and then, but we're trying to make changes in that. And then kind of a last resort funding is state and county. So one of the things that you just always have to keep in mind is where's the money coming from to pay for services and supports, and how can we influence the money. Because if you influence the money, you can influence the service. The way you influence the money is policy, and Beth's going to pick that piece up, but it's just a critical component. Who's an expert on Medicaid or medical assistance in Minnesota? Anybody work in that system and want to share with folks about it? There's a lot of grins.
Anybody who's taken the policy class today, here is hopefully. It's so complicated.
It's very complicated. That's a good answer, Whitney. It's very complicated.
See, you're an expert. You're an expert in that realization.
So it's called medical assistance, or MA, in Minnesota. It's called something different in every state. It has certain target populations, so it's a federal program that was designed to help meet the needs of this list: children and families, pregnant women, adults without children, seniors, and people who are blind or disabled. That's the intent of the federal program. It's designed for people who have low income, and Rebecca will get these slides up. If you click on that link, it takes you to all the criteria around low income. How many assets can you have, and what your income threshold has to be. Fundamentally, Medicaid is a health insurance program. It's a health care plan. Some states take that very literally, and that's what Medicaid offers. Our state's pretty unique in we use Medicaid to fund a lot of long-term services and supports for kids and adults, and that's really important because we can. The law allows you to do it, but not all states do it. It's offered through health plans or in a fee-for-service kind, so either a managed care entity or in a fee-for-service kind of area. So one thing to keep in mind is Medicaid is a federal program. It's a federal law passed by the United States Congress. Every state and the District of Columbia and the territories have uniquely different Medicaid programs. No two states are the same. States get to determine what their Medicaid plans look like. So it widely varies what's included in Medicaid programs. Then you kind of have to, somebody said, I think somebody said, you know families that move to different counties because they know they're going to get better services. And so states are different. The states where the policy lies, but counties interpret and implement policy. And so it varies widely even at that county level. And in Minnesota, a number of us could tell you, here's the counties that do the best. One of the things that's very unique, I think, to Minnesota is we've taken medical assistance, which is essentially a health care plan, and we've said we're going to maximize Medicaid and medical assistance. We're going to use medical assistance not only for acute care, health care for people who are low income, who are in those categories that I showed you, but we're also going to maximize it so that people can have good lives in the community. It's a huge priority of our state. The per capita spending on Medicaid services in Minnesota is way up in the top. And sometimes those of us that work in the system, we're always trying to improve it. Some groups want to abolish it and start all over again as their long-term strategy. We kind of get in that because we want to make it better, right? It doesn't always work smoothly, and we want to make it better. And in Minnesota, I think I have to remind myself that we do a lot. I want to walk you through kind of how we can see that policy matters. How many of you would say you're a policy wonk and you do your best to advocate and change policy on a very regular basis. It's just a big part of your passion. How many of you would self-identify? Very few. Very few. It's not natural instinct in helping professions support professions. We're all about the individual person and the individual family and trying to make a difference. And the policy is more looking across populations and whole communities and how do we make it better for all. And so one way we do that is to pass legislation. We pass something called the Americans with Disabilities Act. And I'll backtrack to say the most significant disability policy in this country has been passed and signed by Republicans. Most of us in this room would not think that to be the case, but it is the case. George Bush was president when the ADA passed. Once a law passes, then it's the law, right? And if the law is not implemented in the way it's supposed to be, in the United States, more so than other countries in the world, we sue. If something doesn't happen the way it's supposed to do based on policy, we hire an attorney and we sue. So the ADA is the law. This court case resulted in a fundamental change and shift in all kinds of policy in the United States and greatly influenced Medicaid policy. So the basic premise of the case were these two women were living in an institution. They didn't want to live there anymore. The state wouldn't allow them to live in the community. They sued, and a court decision came out known as the Olmstead Act. How many of you, Olmstead decision, how many of you know that? It's good. The Olmstead decision basically said people have the right to live in the most integrated setting. And it just billowed into some significant changes in the way we fund programs and what we fund for children and adults to keep kids with their families and not placed in segregated programs. So let's just track a little bit about what's happened since that policy was developed. A number of things to celebrate in terms of networks coming together, the Department of Justice filing lawsuits against states to improve health care, to improve community living for folks. And then a number of I call them kind of trickle-down policies are a result really of the Olmstead decision that was based on the Americans with Disabilities Act. So some of the things that we put into place are money follows the person. Has anybody ever heard of that in Minnesota, MFP? The idea is if a child is eligible to live in a nursing home or to live in a group home, and we're going to pay $100,000 a year for them to do that, we should allow for that money to follow that child so they can stay at home with their family or so they can live in a least restrictive environment. And the federal government provided incentives to states to make that happen. So states, a lot of states, Minnesota really isn't one of those. And we tend to jump in and try to make change, but a lot of states are super resistant to change. So the federal government tries to create some incentives, financial incentives. So that's what money follows the person is. Then there was something called the BIP. Has anybody heard of the BIP? Balancing Incentives Program. Again, Medicaid dollars. So I should back up, and this is the way I think about Medicaid. Federal government pays half, states pay half. It's not exactly like that in every state. Minnesota is about a 50-50 state. Some states, the federal government, the poorer the state per capita, the federal government pays more. So some states it's a 70% federal portion and a 30% state portion. But in general, think of it as 50-50. So what does that mean? If the feds are going to pay half and the state has to pay half, who decides where the money comes from and how much money you're going to spend in Medicaid? the federal level, who decides? Congress. So Congress tells CMS what to do by the laws they pass. Then CMS figures out all the formulas, the ratios that. They set forward kind of the guidance around, okay, states, we have this program called Medicaid. We have some rules. There's a component around statewide-ness. If you're going to have dental care in your Medicaid program, it has to be available to everybody who's eligible statewide. Or if you're going to authorize payment for G-tubes, it has to be available to everybody statewide who's eligible for Medicaid. So that's what CMS does. At the state level, who... Oh, Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. So it's a federal agency that has oversight for Medicaid. Where would decisions at the state level get made? The legislature. So if we want to increase or reduce the waiting list for certain services, it's the people you vote for that make those decisions. And then DHS or Department of Health or whatever the state agency is carries that out. So who you vote for and the actions you take make a difference.
Remember I did say that 50-50 is under review at the moment. The legislature is actually looking at making changes.
So the state legislature would not have any power to determine what the split is. That comes from the federal government, from Congress and CMS. What the state can decide is, what are we going to pay for? What's our program going to look like? What's our eligibility criteria? We're much more lenient than a lot of states. And they would decide what are the major programmatic areas within Medicaid. So Medicaid has state plan services. That's everybody gets whatever's in that state plan. If you're eligible for Medicaid, the state has to assure everybody gets it. And then there's something called, the street name is the waiver. How many of you have heard of the waiver? Okay. The waiver is really home and community-based services, or the HCBS waiver program. And the reason it has that street name is the federal government said to states when Reagan was president, we will waive some of the federal regulations to you, state, and we'll basically give you a block grant. We're going to give you a chunk of money. We're not going to hold you accountable to the same regulations that we do other Medicaid programs, and you can have the flexibility to decide how you want to spend that money. That's really essentially what a waiver is. And that gave states more flexibility to provide long-term services and supports. So its legal authority is it has to be federally approved, and then the state legislature is who says, okay, this is how much we'll let you grow our Medicaid program, or here's the caps we'll put on it. In Minnesota, we have 5 different waiver programs. So now think if you're a family and you're trying to get services and you're trying to get eligible for Medicaid and you're trying to figure out, well, what's medical assistance versus what's Medicaid, but really they're the same thing. It's a very complex and confusing system. And we have 5 waivers. So we have the brain injury waiver, we have the CAC waiver, Beth help me, I never can remember CAC and CADDY, the DD waiver, and the elderly waiver. And each one of those waivers, do you see those statutes? Each one the legislature has to be involved in to approve. And so if we have a waiting list of 3,000 people for DD waiver, it's not like DHS can just say, okay, we're going we're going to get rid of that waiting list. The legislature has to appropriate that 50% that's Minnesota's share so we can draw down the federal money. You guys are all looking at me like, oh, it's complicated. So of the 5 waivers, this is kind of, they do target different groups. Their names kind of give you a hint about who they target. The alternative care waiver is people who are 65 or older and might be at risk of having to go to a nursing home. Brain injury waiver are people who have acquired or traumatic brain injuries and need specific services related to that brain injury. And this is how creative I think we are in Minnesota. One of the huge, and I don't think it passed last, but I was trying to get fetal alcohol spectrum disorder included as an approved group of people under brain injury. It did not pass, did it?
No.
Yeah, they'll come back. But again, that's sort of strong advocacy, using the infrastructure we have, trying to make a sound argument for expansion of a Medicaid-funded program. We have community alternative care. I tend to think of that as a lot of the kids that you're seeing who have really significant medical conditions, or maybe are coming out of a NICU and need really intensive home support. They get it there. The CADI, again, is based on nursing home level of care. In Minnesota, we tend to serve a lot of people with mental illness under the CADI waiver. Not its intent at all. It was never designed for that. It was designed for people primarily with physical disabilities, but having supportive policy makers and strong advocates led to, it's the primary long-term services and support for people with mental health issues in Minnesota. And then we have the DD waiver. One positive thing about our developmental disability waiver is it has a related conditions clause. So if you have functional limitations and you may not have a developmental disability, you still can be eligible. So what that means is people who have autism, who don't have a co-occurring intellectual disability, typically can be determined eligible under our DD waiver. Now the problem is just because you're determined eligible doesn't mean you get the waiver, because one of the rules that we waive in the waiver is statewide-ness. So you can be eligible, but you don't necessarily get it. It's not an entitlement. And that's the challenge. We got good services when you get them, but when you don't get them, they're not very effective services, right? Yep.
So to be eligible for these services, you have to have medical assistance?
Yes, you have to have medical assistance to get any of these services. So you have to be deemed eligible for Medicaid, and then have the categorical kinds of disabilities that are associated with each waiver. Or pay for TEFRA. Why don't you explain what TEFRA is?
So TEFRA is the version of MA for families that don't meet the income limitations. So it's a monthly fee. It's pretty expensive, so it's not individual based, it's based on the family. So if you have more than one child with a disability, then it's based on your family, not on each child. So you pay like one fee per month instead of per child. It's pretty high in Minnesota, and we've advocated a couple different times to get that fee reduced, and it's been reduced. Then it seems to climb back up there again, which is kind of where it's at again. It's starting to go back up again, but it's pretty expensive. I know at the end of the year you can, you can turn your bills back in because they won't make you pay for any services that you didn't receive.
The fees are pretty high for middle income families
Yes.
and above.
Yes.
Because it's a sliding fee scale. So families that have very limited income don't pay very much in terms of a fee, if anything. So, but it's not the most equitable system.
That's a good way to put it.
And families often will choose TEFRA when their private health insurance doesn't cover the kinds of services that they could get under the waiver. Or it used to be the case when they meet lifetime maxes, but so under each of these programs, there's something called, they're called slightly different, but there's this concept of self-direction. So each of these programs, a person gets determined eligible, and then they get allocated a daily rate. I'm just going to use $100 as the daily rate. I'll show you actual daily rates in a minute. But in most of them, you can choose a self-directed option. The DD waivers is called Consumer-Directed Community Supports, or CDCS. It's considered kind of the most flexible and the most progressive service. So if I'm allocated $100 a day, I can totally be in charge of my family members' services or my own services if I choose this as my service option. And that means I can hire my own staff, I can write my own support plan, I can determine where I want my money to go. And you do that though, but your allocation, if you start at $100 a day, it drops to $70 a day. So you can get that flexibility, but you lose some of the money. And essentially there's a list of, used to be really truly you could spend the money on whatever. So if you needed to spend the money to hire a babysitter so you could go on date night, or if mom needed to get a massage every week, you could spend the money on whatever was going to make it work with your family. Over time, there's a growing list of things that are not allowed. And that list kind of evolved because neighbors would go to elected officials and say, this is ridiculous. They're buying rainbow playground equipment using government, my tax dollar monies, etc. Well, the family likely didn't buy a whole rainbow, you know, that's expensive, like high-end playground equipment stuff for your backyard. They probably did not ever buy the whole thing, but they might have bought an adaptive swing for their child to put on that rainbow equipment. Or one rumor that was going around that really almost killed the program was that parents were putting swimming pools in their backyards. And it wasn't ever really that parents were putting swimming pools in their backyards. They had a swimming pool and they were putting a lift on the swimming pool so the child could get into the pool and have their friends over for pool parties. But these sort of untrue rumors almost killed this program, and as such, there's a list of things you can't spend the money on. There are a lot of non-home and community-based service type supports too that families and individuals can receive. So they're not a part of the waiver. They're not a part of all of those. They're mostly funded from state plan medical assistance or other sources. So for example, on our state plan medical assistance program in Minnesota, we have something called personal care assistance. We have a consumer support grant where you can get people coming into your home as personal care assistants or home health folks or private duty nursing to pay for support to your family member. There's something called a family support grant, which is it seems like counties often offer that to people who are on wait lists. So you get a little bit of family support, respite, those kinds of things while you're on a wait list for waivered services. Often you can get home care services if if a medical professional prescribes it. And there are very few intermediate care facilities for people with developmental disabilities left in Minnesota, but you can, it's an entitlement program. So if you're really struggling at home with your family and they need you not to live there anymore, or if a parent dies, your last remaining parent dies and there's no family for you to go live with, you can live in an intermediate care facility. They're sort of like a specialized nursing home for people with developmental disabilities. And we do have several left in Minnesota, but we're not making any new ones. And as people leave, we're trying to close them because they're much more expensive. There are day training and habilitation programs. They're also kind of known as a sheltered workshop. How many of you have heard of those? So depending on your perspective, these are great family respite, or they're, some advocates would call them day wasting centers. They're intended to be places where people go to work, but more often than not, there's no paid employment associated with them. And then we have a series of kind of rehab options. There's something called relocation service coordination that we'll pay for out of medical assistance, which if you're living with your family or you're living in a group place and you want to live in a smaller, more individualized support place, Medicaid will pay for that. It can be funded off of state MA. So if a family's on TEFRA or the child's covered by MA, it can be covered there. It can be covered out of that family support grant, or if a child's got the waiver, it'll be covered. I'm going to stop here and get to the data next time.